At 8 billion, we're living much better than when we were 4 billion. And I think the idea that we have to take our numbers down to save ourselves and to save the planet is completely delusional. When we were 1 billion, back in 1800, probably a third of kids died before the age of 5. Most people didn't make it to the age that they could reproduce themselves. Most people were a couple of meals away from being hungry or starving. So we've made incredible material progress as human beings while our numbers have gone up.
Paul Morland is a British demographer and author.
This week, James and Paul discuss.
What is the problem with not having enough children?
As you go from high infant mortality, lots of people dying very young and having 6 or 7 on average, towards very few, if any, dying and people having a couple. What then goes wrong that they then don't have a couple? They have on average 1 or even fewer than 1.
I know some people not having children because if they wanted to have a child, both of them wanted to work, and if they both worked, the child would have to be in daycare and they'd only see their child for about an hour and a half a day. So they said, that's not fair on the child, therefore we're just not going to have children at this stage in our life. Why is it that the government are so blind to the fact that if you create these environments, you're going to make the situation worse?
I do see these issues. And I wrote an article in the Sunday Times about 3 years ago. Well, they headlined it, "Is it time to tax the childless?" And what I said in that article was,
Isn't it annoying when people interrupt your podcast to promote random crap and spend a minute talking about the benefits? I respect your time, so I'll do it in 12 seconds. These are some of our Newtonic products, and they're really good. So please head to newtonic.com and find out for yourself. Right, let's go back to the episode now. Don't forget, newtonic.com. What is the problem with not having enough children?
there are 2 problems, I think. The first is it's quite sad for people who'd like children. There's a sort of personal, subjective sense of something missing in your life. But that's really difficult to persuade people of. Either you get it or you don't. And some people genuinely would rather not have children. So the whole kind of personal, subjective side of things. The more objective side that you can talk about more freely is that if you imagine Korea, where 100 people of the grandparents' generation produce about 33 people of the parents' generation, create about 11 people of the grandchild's generation. So you go from 100 people in one cohort to 33 in the next, to 11 in the next. Now that's Korean fertility at its lowest now. If that's what stays the case in Korea, that's what will happen. And even if it went 150, 150, 25, what that means is you've got population decline and population aging. So population aging just means you've got an awful lot of old people who need pensions, who need care, who need very expensive health care as well as the social care. The average 80-something costs 6, 7, 8 times as much as the NHS, the average 20-something or 30-something. So you've got this enormous expense, you've got this enormous demand for labour, and then a reducing number of people to pay the taxes and provide the labour. So you have an upside-down population pyramid. Traditionally, population pyramids were like that. The older people had died off, the younger people were numerous, and there are lots of kids. And over time, as people live longer and have smaller families, the population pyramid goes like that, which is why our economy is growing so slowly, which is why the government finances are under so much pressure. So that's the aging. And then over time, the population just declines. Now, an economy will decline. Government debt will be borne by fewer and fewer people because the government has got all this debt and there are going to be fewer and fewer taxpayers. And you also get the sense of human decline. If you go to a country with very rapid population decline, you'll find villages are abandoned, schools shut down, businesses struggle to make it. You'll have a bunch of villages which have been more or less abandoned. The roads out to the village are no longer maintained. And then the small town which served them doesn't really function anymore. There's no longer a flight from the capital. And there's this sense of humans retreating, which some environmentalists may think is a good thing. And we'll probably come on to the environmental perspective. I don't think you can avoid it. But to me, as someone who likes people and thinks human life is a good thing, that's a sign of human defeat.
It's like an inverted pyramid scheme where for a profitable pyramid scheme, you need fewer people at the top and they need to recruit and recruit and recruit and everything feeds up. So inverting that onto its head means completely the opposite. And I suppose we're kind of almost gaslit in some way for the last however many, 10, 15, 20 years, that there are too many people. Even if you were to ask people, is there enough room on Earth? They'd be like, no, there's not enough room. And one of the places I've seen, I have a weird fascination with abandoned buildings. If I'm ever on TikTok, I get served like an abandoned theme park in Japan. And there's something quite haunting about it. And I think I'm drawn to it because it's kind of actually a bit scary that you think people used to live here one day for one business. This would have been the proudest day of their life. They opened this theme park. This is going to go on for generations and generations. And before you know it, the overgrown wilderness is coming in to consume it. So even as a human that doesn't even know that much about it, I'm fascinated to look at it because exactly like you say, it shows something is going wrong, something is going into decline. When we look at, how many humans should or could the world, if we were to park, let's say, environmental factors or everything else, to be cohesive? Because after 100 people, that community aspect doesn't quite work and you need states and governments and everything. What could the world potentially cope with?
It really depends on technology. Out the technology of 1800, say, when there were about 1 billion people as opposed to 8 billion people, say just over 200 years ago, where we had barely started the Industrial Revolution, the world struggled to support 1 billion people. Now, the world can support 8 billion very well. We can support it with, there's more than enough food, there's more than enough space. I mean, if you look out the window, I always say if you land in London, if you land in Stansted or Gatwick, look out the window. You're in commuter belt. There's miles and miles of space. Of course, if you're in the city centre, you have a false sense of people being very compressed. But there's loads and loads of room. As anyone who spends time in the countryside understands, the vast majority of space, even in southeast England, is available. We get better and better at producing food. We get better and better at producing everything, really. And we get better at doing it in an environmentally economic way. So we produce more and more for less and less. So I wouldn't set a target of, we could be 20 billion or 40 billion or 90 billion. Wouldn't that be wonderful? That's not really what I'm about. I'm simply saying that if we don't have on average a couple of kids, which let's face it, is not a big deal. I mean, I've got 3. Okay, so not a huge family. I know lots of people with none. I know lots of people with 5 or 6, or a fair number of people with 5 or 6. And I once met a family of 15, actually. The averaging out at 2 doesn't seem a big deal. And if we got there globally, the population would stabilize at something like 8 to 10 billion. And I think with developing technology, that is perfectly sustainable environmentally, even at today's technology. And as technology gets better, we have all sorts of things, hyperponics and clever ways of producing energy. And you would probably find if we stabilize at about 10 billion, we could give more and more back to nature and live better and better as human beings. So I'm not setting some kind of global target. I'm simply saying that as more and more countries fall below 2, and in some cases significantly below 2, like Korea, or as in the case of the UK and lots of other countries in Western Europe, North America, the fertility rate's falling really quickly now as more and more Generation Z come into the potential breeding pool, if you like, with a whole different set of attitudes. My concern is not that we aren't going to double and double and double again, as we have done, but that we will go into a kind of terminal decline. And if someone could say to me, would you be satisfied with a future in which the global average was 2, the population topped out at about 10 billion, and human beings sort of lived along those lines with ever better technology to support them, I think that's a perfectly good future. A little modest growth, an average of 3 children, so maybe each cohort half the size again of the last one is healthy and good, and I think we could certainly manage it. I think we've got the space, we've got the resources. There's a famous economist called Julian Simon, an American economist, who wrote a book called The Ultimate Resource, and the ultimate resource is the human brain, and the human brain is incredibly creative and can do all sorts of incredible things. So I think even if we doubled our numbers, which we're never going to, we would find ways to cope. And actually, just to conclude the rather long, rambling answer to your question, at 8 billion, we're living much better than when we were 4 billion. And at 4 billion, we lived much better than when we were 2 billion. And at 2 billion, we lived better than when we were 1 billion. When we were 1 billion, back in 1800, probably a third of kids died before the age of 5. Most people didn't make it to the age that they could reproduce themselves. Most people were a couple of meals away from being hungry or starving. Most people were illiterate. So we've made incredible material progress as human beings while our numbers have gone up. And I think the idea that we have to take our numbers down to save ourselves and to save the planet is completely delusional.
I live in Australia, where I believe it's been about 50 years since they've been beyond that population rate of over 2 children per family. When you have that discussion with people, they can't believe it. No, I'm on a wait list for a nursery. I can't get in for a very long time. There are loads of kids. And another way that I tried to explain it to them, where if you say to someone on average we're having 1.5 children or 1.6, they don't quite get it. But because in the pandemic we had the term R0 for an infectious disease. They said, and I could be wrong, tell me if I'm wrong, if the R0 goes above 1, you're going to infect more people, and they're going to infect more people, which is going to infect more people. And what you need to do for an infectious disease is get the R0 beneath 1. And when it's beneath 1, there are less people, there are less people, there are less people. And eventually the direction of infectious disease depends on that R0. And the fertility rate is directly correlated with that.
course, yeah.
So I'm saying to them that, if it takes 2 people to make 1.9, we're in that negative equity position. And you still don't really see them computing, and they'll have to go to social media, and there'll be a tweet from Elon Musk, or there'll be some kind of newspaper article, or the Chinese might have gone back on having 1 child per person. Why is it? Is it purely just confirmation bias, or is this an engineered opinion that we're kind of fed to think differently about the world?
I don't think it's a conspiracy. Of course, there are people who really want us to have fewer children and think of the human being as a disease that we should control and potentially wipe out entirely. I mean, there are such people. There are such antinatalists who think human beings are a curse on the planet. So there are such people, and they do have their wiles and their ways. But I think generally people don't understand demography, although it's really quite simple. So I think it's not very well taught in schools. I think a little bit of demography goes a long way. So just
You have to
understanding.
explain to someone what demography
Yeah.
is.
Okay, demography is the study of population. How many people are born, how many people die, where people move to. So it's just the study of population. So some basics are understanding of fertility rate. How many children does the average woman have? The birth rate, how many children born per thousand of the population. And those two don't necessarily correlate, because it depends how many fertile women there are in the population relative to the whole population.
If you have less young people, although you might have a certain different birth rate, if there are less women having less women, there are going to be less women to
Yeah,
have.
so you could take 2 countries with identical populations, and one's had an enormous population expansion, loads of young women, they're not having many children. And the other hasn't had that expansion, and those young women are having lots of kids each. So in the one, you would have a high birth rate. This may be a bit technical, because lots of births relative to population, but that's just because there are loads of young women. But that's bad in the long term, because it's going to go like that. And the other one, there aren't that many young women that are having lots of kids. Higher fertility rate, not such a high birth rate. So I think really, to get back to your question, the point is people don't learn about demography, and I've kind of made it a mission of mine to write books and do podcasts and try and explain it. I think there's a lot of a sense of people's view of the world being shaped by the way the world was 50 or 60 years ago. So I was born in 1964. That was probably a peak year for global population growth. So what was actually happening? People had always had loads of kids, right? Historically, high fertility, they died early, small population. Then you go through what's called the demographic transition. First of all, your mortality rates come down. You get better food, you get better healthcare. People are still having loads of kids, and so that's when the population grows fast. And back in 1964, lots and lots of developing countries were in that space. They were just getting their mortality down. They're still having loads of kids. Global population was growing more than 2% a year. And that's pretty dramatic growth. That's all changed now. So countries like Jamaica and Thailand, Puerto Rico would be the lowest fertility state in the US if it were a state. Loads of quite poor countries have very, very low fertility now. People are still in the mindset that somewhere in the world, people are having very large families, the population's growing very rapidly, and we have to change that. And I think that's because of the 1960s mindset. There's a famous book by a guy called Paul Ehrlich called The Population Bomb, which laid all these problems out in the 60s and didn't realize that just as already at that point, the Europeans had gone through that transition, they'd got that lower mortality rate, they were living longer, and then gradually their fertility rates came down. So that has now happened in the rest of the world. And so instead of this just being a European, rich European and North American problem, it's become a global problem. So as I said, you've got countries like Jamaica and Thailand. China, massive country, was until recently the biggest population in the world. It's now the second biggest, probably a fertility rate of 1, which means each cohort is half the size of the last one.
Who's overtaken China?
India.
I thought it might.
But even in India, the fertility rate is now coming down and is about 2 and is falling quite quickly. And there are parts of India where it's very, very low. In Kerala or West Bengal, the fertility rate's lower than in Britain. So we can see India going in the same direction. Now, what that means, you've got lots of young people. They're not having any kids. You've still got loads of 20, 30-somethings in the workplace. So the fact that they're not having many kids is all that means you don't have to spend much on education. It's only in 20, 30 years' time that you start to have the problem. So India's problem is 20 or 30 years away. So they're probably not worrying about it too much. We today are suffering in Britain and in Europe and in lots of East Asia and in lots of the world from the fact that we stopped having enough children back in the 70s.
So about 30, 40 years ago, I suppose we see some technological advancements, which are fantastic when we look at them, childbirth, preventative measures, looking after pregnant women better. And it's a sad thing to say, but I assume that over the years before that, women or families would have coverage with their children. I'm not sure if this is true. You might be able to correct me, but if they were to give a name to a child and it was to die, they'd pass it to the next child, or in some cases, hundreds of years ago, they wouldn't even name the child until it got to a certain age. Is that right?
In some cultures, that's true, yes.
Because the likeliness now...
I think a year they were... In some cultures, when children reached a year-old, they'd name them.
Which is quite a sad reality. And even if you were to say, okay, on average, families were having 5 children, only 3 made it to the point that they could have children. In today's world, that would be a very, very sad state of affairs. The second thing I want to touch on as well is something I've only learned recently. When we're talking about fertility rates, are we looking more at the choice to have children or the ability to have children?
Okay, so let me take those two quite separate questions. First of all, there was very high infant mortality rate in every society until the 19th century, everywhere. Perhaps a half of children would die before they reached their teen years. Maybe a quarter or a third would die before they reached the age of 1. And because that's now quite a long way back, I mean, one of my grandfathers was born in the 1880s, right? So I've got a bit of a memory, because my father was relatively old, but I was born I've got a bit of a memory of what conditions were like back then, because I had a babysitter who was brought up in Edwardian London. That's the advantage of being a bit older. But that memory goes very quickly. And I think people have forgotten, if they went back to their great-grandparents or their great-great-grandparents, they may well have found that many of their brothers and sisters died. Maybe they weren't spoken about. That fell very quickly. From the Edwardian period, really, infant mortality started to fall in Britain, and now it's falling everywhere. So this is now a global phenomenon, a wonderful thing that children are living longer. But I think people have kind of lost sight of that. And in those societies where less than half, fewer than one child, less than one child in 2 would reach the age of having their own children. If you hadn't had 6 or 7, the human race would have died out. So there is this lost memory of very high infant mortality. Fortunately, we've gone through that, and we've forgotten it. I think one of the problems of having forgotten it is it's part of a problem of people thinking times are terrible. One of the reasons people don't have kids is, life is so awful now. And they don't understand, if they went back 4 or 5 generations, most people were very poor. They didn't know where the next meal was coming from. And if they had a kid, the chance of that kid living was not that great. Now, most parents, listen, I have a friend who lost a child at a few months old. It still happens. But for most people, the prospect of losing a child is very, very remote.
You would never want 2 children and have 3 just in case. If you were to say that, someone would be like, oh, that's ridiculous. Whereas exactly what you say there.
Well, I don't know if people made exactly that calculation, but still the simple fact is if you were not a high fertility society, you wouldn't exist. You'd just have died out. For whatever reason, if people had chosen to have and been able to have very small families, when the half of children were dying before they got to their age of fertility themselves, those societies would have died out. So the only societies that existed were societies with some kind of ethos or lack of technology to control fertility or some kind of urge to have children. So that's all changed, of course, because people don't expect to lose their children. Now, to come back to your other point, what do we mean by fertility? I think people get a bit confused here. There's biological fertility and there's demographic fertility. So biological fertility is what's the chance of people having children if they want them. If they engage in normal sexual congress at ages, let's say, between their late teens and their mid-30s. I mean, that doesn't mean people can't have children outside that range. That's the normal range. Say in your 20s and 30s, increasingly very early 40s, if you are trying to have kids, how long does it take you? Can you have them? Do you hit problems? Now, the best data we have for all the talk of loss of sperm count and so on is that people trying to have children at a given age are not finding it more difficult. If there is more infertility in the biological sense, it's because more and more people are leaving it later and later. And we know that particularly women's fertility trails off quite quickly in the course of their 30s and particularly from the mid-30s. And male fertility also trails off. And also the other thing I always say is that men are deluding themselves if they think they'll all, it's not a problem for me because I can always find a younger woman. These days, men don't always find younger women. So, as you get into your 40s and 50s, to think you'll find a woman of fertile years is delusional for most men, unless you're Elon Musk or a famous sports influencer or whatever. So that's biological fertility. And as I say, the best evidence we have suggests that the trailing off, the problems are not of any other than or the growth. Of course, some people have real problems, some people can't have children. And that's always been the case. You ever need to read the book of Genesis to read about women who can't have children, or Samuel and so on. But the idea of biological fertility declining is not very well evidenced. When demographers talk about fertility, they simply mean how many children do people have? Now, if they're not having children, why are they not having children? There are a host of reasons for that. Among them may be biological. So if you had a slump of biological fertility, you'd see it but what's actually happened is that demographic fertility has fallen. We don't really think biology itself has changed that much. So what's going on? If it's not the biology, beyond people choosing to have children later, which is significant, why are they choosing to have children later? Why are they choosing to have fewer? Why are they not having them at all? Now, obviously, the ability to control your fertility is one thing. So if you go from a society where people can't take contraception, or they don't have access to it, they don't understand it, to one where they do, you'd expect the fertility rate to fall, the demographic fertility rate to fall. But while all of those things are happening, while people get their education, they're more urban, they're more likely to use contraception, just as their fertility rate falls, so the infant mortality rate falls. So that's usually not a problem. The question is, as you go from high infant mortality, lots of people dying very young and having 6 or 7 on average, towards very few, if any, dying and people having a couple, what then goes wrong that they then don't have a couple? They have on average 1 or even fewer than 1.
So I like to think I've engaged in this a little bit, but I want to know how wrong I am with my assumptions. So if you were to ask me, I would say one of the first things would be housing. And maybe some people's aspirations to have that nuclear family, if they don't have a house or you're still living with the boys, because I did this personally through the pandemic, lived with 3 of my mates. And whilst living with my best friends, I was like, why would I ever want to change this? What, you tell me I've got to pay the bills myself and not go wake up my mates when we want to have fun or whatever? So that idea of not being able to afford a house or not wanting to afford a house, I think could then impact someone's ability or likeness to get married. I moved in with my partner, and then since we're now engaged, but we kind of house first, live together, coexist, then marriage. I know it used to be the other way around. And for young people now, looking from the outside in, the availability to get housing, afford housing, in Australia, our average house price in Sydney is about $1.8 million. So it's about, or actually $1.6 million, about £800,000. And when you look at the average salaries, I'm pretty sure the average millennial, Gen Z, are probably going to be saving for 10 to 14 years before they can even put down a deposit for a house. So for a lot of people, if they're going to give up on owning a home, they're probably going to be giving up on getting married, and they're probably going to be giving up on any of the other traditional sense of making a family. Am I close?
I think that is part of the picture. So I always say that sorting out the housing problem is a necessary but not a sufficient condition. So what do I mean by that? I think it does put off a lot of people having kids. I think we need to address it. I think we can address it, actually. It's actually doable. I think one of the things you just have to do is get rid of the boomer NIMBYs we have to build. But we also have to change regulations around housing. We've got a lot of public housing stock, which is not necessarily going to local young people wanting to have children. If you fill your housing stock in the centre of London with people from overseas, then young people in Britain are not going to be able to start their own families. So there's a whole question about housing, and if we don't sort it, we won't sort this problem out. But there is a but. When you've sorted it, that doesn't mean necessarily that you've sorted out the problem of fertility. And the reason I say that is if you look in the UK at places where the property is quite cheap, you still find that fertility rates are quite low. There's not a really good correlation within the UK of house prices on the one hand and fertility on the other. Now, you might say, oh, then it's about affordability. Like you go out to some corner of the countryside and you'll find the housing's cheap, but the wages aren't very high. Then what it really amounts to is not objectively the housing cost. It's people's earning power, our wealth. Now, if we're wealthier than we've ever been as a society, but we can't afford to have children, when our great-great-grandparents who were poverty-stricken could, it's actually not objectively about wealth or about housing. It's about something to do with priorities. And equally, if you look at a lot of countries in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, if you look at parts of China where they've got lots of empty accommodation, it's not clear that just providing people with cheap accommodation is going to sort the problem out. So we have to do it, but it's not. Anyone who comes out who understands the problem and then says it's all because of X, there's one cause that will explain it, doesn't really understand it at all.
So that's really interesting. And also that makes complete sense. So then I also have another theory that say 50s, 60s, 70s, you go to work, you come home, whether or not your traditional wife, let's say, and you sit down, you've read the paper, there might be a radio on that you listen to in the evenings. Kind of after a while go, oh, this house would be nice to put a few kids in it. Whereas now we have distractions, we have stress, we have social media, we have this hustle culture, work culture, people get home. And even if you had a biological urge or ticking in your head that maybe you should start a family, you could just doom scroll on TikTok, go to bed early, then do your fitness regime at 5 a.m. and think, why would I ever change this and ruin this by having children? And that kind of connotation of, how we live life at the moment, we have so many distractions that if you are, say, a woman, 28, 29, 30, those maybe urges or inclinations to have children could all easily be pushed to the back of the pile to watch a new episode of Love Island or to do whatever. That's not me painting all women as loving Love Island, but the same. Is it a cultural thing, technological thing? Has social media, do you think, played a big impact in this?
Well, I mean, we did have the two Bronnies back in the 1970s, and they were never thought of as an excuse or Morecambe and Wise as a reason for people not having children. So there are a couple of answers to this. The first is I think there's a lot going on in the culture that is not antenatal necessarily, but is undermining people having families. So it's not saying don't have families, children are horrible, but it's just a load of other stuff going on that is a distraction. I think you're right. And that's why I think you've got to fix the material side of things. You've got to fix the incentives, the taxes, the housing, the childcare. All of that's got to be sorted out and can be sorted out. But when you've done all of that, it's the culture you've got to change. And what you've got to put in place, we're not going back to the 1950s, okay? We're not going back to 2 television channels in black and white with Richard Baker on the news stuff that most of your listeners won't even remember. And I wouldn't want to. I mean, there's lots that's brilliant about the world today. I think I was a father before I sent my first email. So I do actually remember the world. And it's marvelous. There's stuff on YouTube. I mean, I spend loads of time, whenever I have a bath or I'm doing the ironing, it's always something really interesting to listen to, as opposed to just what happened to be on the radio that evening. So there's lots of really exciting stuff, but I think none of that's going away. So then the question is, what countervailing stuff can we put in place of it? Or as well as it, that is going to say, okay, all these things exist, but there's also this incredible tendency today that people want kids and it's cool and it's exciting and they love it. And yes, it takes their lives over, but isn't it wonderful? So you're looking really skeptical. How could we change the culture that it's something that the youngsters really want to do? Now, it's not going to happen in your generation. It's not going to happen in your cohort, but it could happen in the next. What would we need to make that happen? That people in their 20s actually said, this is what I really want to do. And I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to answer that question because I'm, as I was telling you earlier, I'm now a grandfather. So people like me are not going to come up with the answers. But when the whole of society can see the problem, it's going to be the young influencers in their 20s who are going to change the climate of the culture. And I do think it needs to be done. I do think it's beyond just the material issues. And if that doesn't happen, we are going to go into a population vortex. So I haven't got the answer. I do think the answer is cultural. I do think it's not about switching those things off, but having something in addition to them. And that something, I've got ideas, I can make suggestions, but it's not going to come from people like me.
We talk about some incentives. I know some countries, we'll probably get into it, have got tax incentives and whatnot. But in the UK at the moment, one of the pressing issues would be the Henrys, the high earners between, let's say, 100K and 140K. And for anyone listening from overseas, in essence, your tax rate gets pretty considerably worse and you lose out on all childcare. So the main discourse online is everyone that's in the kind of lower echelon of tax brackets is like, oh, it's okay for you, you're on 100K, go cry me a river, you're rich, all of those things. Sometimes I think they don't appreciate that the people up at this 100K mark are paying the taxes that help support other people in other places, probably a whole podcast and that altogether. But we're now looking, let's imagine you've come out of university, you've worked for 7 or 8 years, you've done exceptionally well. You are now earning 2 to 3 times the average salary. You're coming up to the cusp of £100,000. You're thinking about having a family and you think, I'm one pay rise away, not from being incentivized to have a family, but being penalized for having a family. That must be a bit of a kick in the teeth for people that get to that position. And I'm sure it actually has an impact further down there as well. When I know some people not having children because they did the maths that if they wanted to have a child, both of them wanted to work. And if they both work, the child would have to be in daycare and they'd only see their child for about an hour and a half a day. So they said, that's not fair on the child. Therefore, we're just not going to have children at this stage in our life. Why is it that the government and the situations in power are so blind to the fact that if you create these environments, you're going to make the situation worse?
Well, it is very frustrating. I mean, I do, although, as I said, I'm not in your generation, I do have 3 kids who are aged between, actually, my son's 27 today, and my daughters are 29 and 31, and my daughters have started to have their kids already. They've both got 2, and my son's already married. So I do see these issues. And I wrote an article in the Sunday Times about 3 years ago saying, is it time to, well, they headlined it, is it time to tax the childless? And what I said in that article was that in many countries, like I was portrayed as some far-right figure for saying this, but, France, Cuba, Hungary, right-wing, left-wing, they have a tax break for those who have children in one form or another. In fact, under Blair and Brown, we kind of had one. These well-known far-right politicians, Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, and it was kind of watered down. In Australia, you had a baby bonus. And what I'm saying, and which was seemed to be quite effective actually, like 20 years ago. I don't know if you've heard of it, but that was under, I think Peter Costello was the treasurer back
Before
then.
my time, but I'll be championing it when I go back.
Yeah. So one way or another, you incentivize people. And what I said in this article was that if we know the government's indebted and borrowing very rapidly. I'm not just going to be another person to go to the chancellor and say, you need to give tax cuts to these people. Of course, it'd be lovely if you could. But maybe we need to raise taxes for some people and lower them for others in order to produce what they've got in France and what they've got in other countries. I also think, and I was on the BBC saying this relatively recently, that the boomer generation are taking far too much in terms of resources. I mean, the example I gave was my free tube pass at 60, which I don't need. But there's this triple lock thing. I mean, so many pensioners, I don't want there to be pension poverty, but the idea of giving all this money to pensioners while we're taxing young people who could be starting families is a dreadful thing. And I think the whole welfare state needs to be reorganized around incentivizing young people to have children and changing those incentives so that you don't have the Henrys or the Nicks or whoever they are, or the Nicholas or the Henriettas saying the field seems to be pitched against me. That's where we need to put the resources. If we want to have an economy and a society going forwards, if we want young workers to be coming in 20, 30 years' time and upholding the country, upholding the economy, paying the taxes, supporting. I mean, there are lots of reasons to have children, but just for the purely economic desire to have an economy in the future, we have to. It's not a question of let's spend more money on this because we haven't got the money. It's the way we spend the money in the welfare state today has got to change radically and be both the tax incentives and the welfare incentives have got to be completely rethought. Now, then the question is, well, who's talking about this in government? So I always said no British government's ever spoken about this. So Macron talked about demographic rearmament, not clear he's done very much. Lots of regimes in the past have been pronatal. People always quote the right-wing regimes in Europe in the 20s and 30s, Mussolini and so. The same is true of the Soviet Union, real existing socialism under various Soviet regimes or communist regimes. I mentioned Cuba. You've got Macron, the centrist in France. It's not a right-wing thing. So I think the first thing we've got to do is get rid of this idea. It's a right-wing thing. If you want to create a socialist economy, a communist paradise, libertarian, whatever you want to do, Thatcherite, Bennite, as we would have said back in the 70s and 80s, whatever you want to do, you can't do it. The only society that's going to be better for fewer people is the sort of society that the antinatalists want to create. So whether you're left, right, or centre, you should want there to be kids being born, a thriving society, and plenty of young workers coming into the workplace in 20 or 30 years' time. So I think the first thing is we've got to get over this sort of nonsense about, it's all a right wing. It's a right wing thing. Of course, there are feminists who are concerned about it, and we have to be very sensitive to their concerns and think about how we can do this in a way that allows young women fully to participate in the workplace. I mean, I was on Twitter the other day talking about it, and there were the usual attacks that, you're only worried about it because it's a problem for white people. So I said, well, have you looked at the fertility, the best we know about the fertility rate of the Afro-Caribbean community in this country? Have you looked at the falling fertility rate of African Americans? Have you looked at the decline of population in China? You're in the mindset of 1920. It's or 1925, it's 2025. This is a global problem. So stop harping on about this noise about, it's just a right-wing plot. It's nonsense. I do think we have to take women's concerns very carefully. Most women say they want children, so how can we help them to do that? So we'd never had a government that had anything to say about it at all. Now, finally, we had a Prime Minister who said something. And what did he say? Nothing to do with me, mate. I'm not interested. But then we had the Secretary of State for Education, Bridget Phillipson, in the UK, saying, this is an issue, and if young women want to have children, we should help them to do so. So that's the first frontline politician, whatever you think of her educational policies. And I don't think very much of them. I do congratulate her on speaking about this. Trump and J.D. Vance are speaking about it in the States, as I said, Macron's. So I think the conversation's moving. We just got to get rid of the sort of taboos, if you like. We've got to shatter the taboos and say this is a human issue. It's not a black or a white issue. It's not a left or a right. It's not a male or a female. It's a human issue. And let's talk about it as a human issue.
The something I want to tiptoe around, I'm glad you're here to help me with, would be that surely this is impacted as well by improving the education of women, more women in the workplace, and a lot more women being career orientated. Now, this is a fantastic thing. And, I'm never going to say, women belong at home to have children or anything of that kind. But if women are going to go into the workplace and seek out a professional career, by the time they get out of university, they're in their early 20s, it could take them 10 years to be well established. And even if 25, 26, 27, which we could say are very good years for fertility because they've established themselves in a professional aspect, but they're young enough to give themselves some time to have babies, they're going to face some kind of penalty. I worked in recruitment a long time ago, and I'll never forget, someone's having an interview over who was going to be the candidate. And as the meeting finished, he went, off the record, this will be a man in this role. And I kind of said to the guy next to me, I go, why is he saying that? And he goes, well, the person will be fresh out of a Big Four accountancy firm. They'll probably have 5-6 years experience. The last thing we want to do is hire someone and them go on maternity leave. And that never crossed my mind at that point. So when we look at women in the workplace, fertility, is this culture of, females wanting to be career dominated? Because am I right in thinking that in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, the amount of women that were in the workplace was much less? And I know I'm really terrible at asking two questions at the same time. It's so I'm worried I'll forget later. And has women in the workplace had an impact on housing prices as well?
Okay, so I have my own particular angle on this because I have a kind of multi-generational view. My mother was the main breadwinner when I was growing up, or she earned more than my father. My wife has earned more than me, which is why I'm able to be a demographer at large. And my daughters are leading extremely successful careers. They both got excellent educations, top universities, into the workplace, started to make their mark, and started their families before they were 30. In the case of my younger daughter, having her second before she's 30. So, and then, just seeing my wife have a very successful career and 3 children, I don't think it's impossible. I think a couple of things are required. The first is, you're absolutely right, because of women in the workplace, it has pushed up house prices, and it's like an arms race, and it has to be the case now that you have 2 working people in a couple to afford a house. I think in many ways that's a good thing because there was an awful lot of wasted talent in the past. I think within the pronatal world, which this little world, this tiny little world, there is a world of pronatal people. There is a division between what I'd call the trad types who say it'll never work unless we find ways to get women back and home if that's what they want. And of course, some people want that. And others who are more inclined to say, that's just, we're not going back to the 1950s. And I'm more in the latter camp, perhaps because of personal experience. My experience is with my own family and also with women I worked in the workplace. They're every bit as good. There are great women and useless women and great men and useless men. And I've had fantastic female bosses, fantastic women working for me or alongside me, and bad men and women so I just don't see the distinction. And therefore we need women in the workplace. So there are two things that are needed then to make that work in a society in which we have a couple of kids on average, 2-3 kids on average. The first is the men have to step up. And I think that's a cultural thing. So, I always say my dad would never have changed a nappy.
That's exactly mine, yeah.
My dad would never have been seen pushing a buggy a pushchair along the high street. I mean, this morning I was pushing 2 of my grandchildren along to Hampstead Heath for a walk. And this evening I'll be picking up one of my grandsons from nursery, which I do quite often. So I think men have got to step up. And if we want women to play their role, men have got to play their role. There are certain things we can't do, but there's an awful lot we can do. And I see my sons-in-law doing it. I'm sure my son will do it and so on. So there's a cultural thing. But I also think there needs to be a governmental thing. I mean, we again, I'm not perhaps the best person who understands the modern workplace and the legislation around it. But I think we could change the law and change the workplace so that, for example, why not have more nurseries in workplaces? Why are there loads of gyms in workplaces and no nurseries? I mean,
you could argue productivity. Right? A fit person might be able to work more, less likely to be ill, less likely to take sick days, better immune system. You could argue the nursery could be a distraction. Oh, where's Trevor? Oh, he's checking on his son.
Stop. Where is the future of the economy? Who are the future workers and the future?
You could probably get them signed up to the organisation, get them in the training.
And the future consumers. Well, that's the problem because no company is going to say, well, people will have children and they'll come and work for us. Yeah. So there's a social gain, and no one company is going to say, well, we'll make. Well, some do in East Asia. I've seen some evidence of that. Just to be good corporate citizens, or because they'll attract good people because that's what their people want. But that's where legislation should come in, and that's where government policy should come in to force companies to be more pronatal, so that there is an economy for them. Because however successful they are as companies, if every year you've got a smaller workforce within the country nationally, and you have a smaller bunch of consumers, once you get into population decline, it's much harder to make money. Companies and economists assume the population will grow and grow and grow. Well, if it is going to grow and grow, we all got to have a responsibility for that. So, in a nutshell, men have to step up. If we want women to play a full part in the economy, we need women to play a full part in the economy. We need to play more of a role in the household and in bringing up children. I think that's perfectly possible. And I think we've moved enormously in that direction. And I think there are a whole bunch of things around legislation about rights, about maternity and paternity rights, about workplace, nurseries, and so on that could encourage that.
It's very interesting you say that. I've never thought of it in that sense. My dad went to work 7, came back at 7. He would have to get on the train, go on the train for an hour and a half, get to the city of London, come all the way home. But the thing you've really helped me understand there is he could now, in the modern era, work from home 2-3 days a week. He would only have to commute. So there's 3, maybe 5, maybe 7 hours a week that he has back, quote unquote, which means that he could be looking after the children for those commuting hours, where his wife could open the laptop, do some of her work responsibilities, even if it's part-time, or vice versa, where if you would have the times have changed. And all of those times that, my dad said never changed a nappy. I still don't think he has to this day. But times are changing. Men don't have to be quite so work-focused. Everyone knows that people working from home are probably doing a 4-hour day at best, stretching it over 7 hours. And they've got all kinds of devices to keep the mouse tracker moving to make it seem like they're active. And in a world, you can actually be more productive and get more done in a short period of time.
Can I just say on that, I mean, one of the ideas I've had, which I haven't heard anyone else suggest, but I think it's a really good one, is when you want people back in the office, you differentiate between those who've got school-age children and those who haven't. And you say, if we want everyone back at least 4 days a week, but if you've got school-age children, it's 2 or 3 days a week. I think that's reasonable. And I know from my own children, I've seen them, they like going to the office and they go in quite a lot. But if they have the odd day when they're not in, it does help drop the kid off at nursery and do the pickup, and then maybe spend some time online later in the evening. It gives you that flexibility. So this is a case where the technology can be used to create a more pronatal environment. And I don't see why companies shouldn't say, well, if you've got that burden of children, the joy, but the burden. And you're producing the economy, the society of the future, the humanity of the future, then we're going to give you a bit of an easier time in terms of needing to be in the office.
You could even say, if you want to drop your kids off and pick them up, as a company culture, you could say, come in and do 10 till 2:30. And then you could say to other people, if you have kids, you can have a shorter day.
And of course, if you did have a nursery in the workplace,
9:30 to 2:45.
well, whatever it is, it's enormously helpful, because I know from my own kids, they have to get to the station, drop the child off, and then get into work from there. And so if you had one at the workplace, I mean, there are difficulties. Not every commute is suitable for young children. But I just think the assumption that workplaces will have cool coffee bars and, as I said, gyms, and bean bags, all the things that gives people the illusion they haven't really left university. But heaven forfend somewhere that you can leave your children, because that's an important part of growing up, is having children.
I hope that you're enjoying the episode. For any of you that may or may not be aware, I'm on a bit of a mission for men to get their testosterone levels checked. So if you're someone that's suffering with low libido, low energy, low mood, or maybe even poor sleep, then if you head to checkyourbloods.com, I'll be able to arrange for you to do a blood test where you can find out where your testosterone is at. Right, that's checkyourbloods.com. There'll be a link in the description below. Right, let's get back to the episode. There's co-working spaces in Australia that do have creches for children. And what's good is, as well as, the use of those co-working spaces can be deducted from their tax bill come the end of the year. So they're not penalized. It's not with post-tax income. They can reduce their profitability, which means that they can coexist in those environments. Would you see there's potentially any issue, or actually you have this trad wife, everyone says women, man, gender roles, 50s, 60s, 70s, but this is going to have to change because the amount of women going through university they're vastly outnumbering men. So when we're coming to these jobs and professional roles, they're going to need people very qualified for it. We are no doubt going to see a lot more women going through these in the future than men. So this, like you say before, trying to relive the 50s and 60s and having a majority male workforce whilst women were doing more traditional roles is not going to sustain because of that demographic change. Is that something else that has to be accounted for?
Well, I think there has been a change in the economy, so that there's been a feminization, if you like, of the economy. So if you go back to the 50s, there were a lot of jobs that required muscle and heft. And a lot of jobs, I mean, it's a bit of a stereotype, but there were a lot of jobs that required strong men or strength, where men definitely had an advantage over women. And those jobs are fewer and farther between. Now, some would say that in the cooperative, collaborative workspace of today, the more empathetic female is more effective. I don't believe that. I think men and women in the modern workplace are equally useful or useless. As I say, with many, many years in the workplace, nothing to do with the demography, I wouldn't say that men are better than women or women are better than men in any particular field. More women are going to university. I've got no problem with people who want to have a trad lifestyle or inverse trad lifestyle where she's out. I think everything should be acceptable. I think we should get rid of the taboos. I think if a man is happy to stay at home and look after the kids, good luck to him. If the woman wants to do that, they want to call that trad or contra. I don't get lots of different lifestyles as long as we have enough children. And in order to do that, I think we need to be more flexible in our thinking about what's normal. If a man stays at home or the woman stays, both get lots of disapproval. I think let's just
as long as you're a happy unit.
Let people do what they want to do and find their own way. And let's make sure that both the government and the corporate sector, the employers, are supporting them so that they can fulfill their choices and live with the consequences. I mean, if one is working rather than two, you're probably going to be less well off, but there are trade-offs to make in life. I think people have to make their own trade-offs, but they can be more supported by the state and by the corporate sector. So I do think we need changes in tax, we need changes in welfare, we need changes in the sorts of things you're talking about. So, for example, if there's nothing to stop an employer having a creche. It's almost unheard of in the UK. I understand it's very, very unlikely. I've never seen it in the UK. So what could you do in terms of tax incentivization or how do you tax the space? Do you make it more, lower the kind of taxes that companies have to pay on space? There are all sorts of things you could do to encourage it. I just don't think we've even started to think about it yet.
There's a very interesting, but this is incredibly interesting kind of part that we're looking at. If we go a little bit further back in time, for instance, people meeting, if we have more women going to university, the ratios are going to be out. If you've got 75% women, less are going to meet, less are going to get into a relationship. The same as in the years before that. We now have the prevalence of dating apps, which I believe are skewing the ability for people to meet the expectations of both parties, the accessibility they have to multiple partners, the fact that you could very easily talk to 10 people at the same time. I believe another issue is, I think it was Rory Sutherland that said Jennifer Aniston and Cameron Diaz were not good looking enough to be supermodels, but they were incredibly attractive when you watch them move in videos, and it's how they interact with other characters that made them so beautiful. And we don't get the same opportunity on dating apps. We get one still image, of which the majority of my time of dating are edited, and in some cases photoshopped, in some cases using filters, not a true representation of it. There are so many men on the other side that if they're not 6 foot, are cast aside, even though the average height of a man is about 5'7". And the dynamics of dating have changed. And the truth is that you could take two people that would say no to each other on a dating app, you could put them together at a bar, and they could have an interaction, end up happily married and have loads of children. The problem is now we have this digital world, we have this very distorted reality of how people are going to meet each other. I believe young people are drinking less than ever. I believe that we've got less guys going to university than ever. The number of 18-year-old men that have never approached a woman is higher than ever. So even if we were to fix the tax incentive, reduce house prices, were to do all of these things up here that can make it so much easier for people to improve their fertility, fundamentally, we have young people not getting into relationships or long-bearing relationships as they used to because of technology.
So this is definitely a problem. And it's yet another issue that needs to be fixed. I've said this before, so apologies if people have heard it on other podcasts I've done, but I went on my first date with my wife in 1985. So I'm not the person to ask about dating apps. But I do understand there is a real problem. There's also a political problem. If you actually look at the attitudes of men and women in the UK and the US, possibly other countries, there's a real divergence. And I think that for those of us who are quite political, I'm quite political, and I find that my wife and I have got an extraordinary congruence of political attitude. And if we didn't, it would really rub us up the wrong way and quite irritate us. And I think that's even more true today in the era of the culture wars and so on. So there are all sorts of problems about young people meeting each other and partnering up. I don't have the answer to that. But I think there will be answers, and I think they'll be very much bottom up. That's not going to come from the government. That's going to come from social organizations. If people want to have partnerships, there are ways that they'll find each other. I don't know what the answer is, but there's probably good old capitalism. There's probably money to be made in some more in real life dating type opportunities. It does seem to me that the dating app is a bad thing, but I wouldn't shut it down. I mean, that sounds far too coercive. But I don't ask me, and I'm sorry because I wish I could give you the answer. I can think about. So first of all, I can talk about the issue. And secondly, I can think about a lot of economics that could change it. I could think about certain cultural things that could change it. For example, sex education lessons that focus more on having children rather than avoiding children and avoiding sexual transmitted diseases. I think there's lots of cultural things I could comment on. The need for men to step up and so on. How we get young people to partner up in the era of the online dating app, which seems to work against it, paradoxically. I've got no answer, but I think probably some young entrepreneurial people will have an answer. And the answer in one part of the world will be different in another part of the world, but it just can't be beyond our ability as a human race that has managed to mate for hundreds of generations and millennia. It can't be beyond our ability to find ways to get young men and young women partnering up again, having sex again, and having children and wanting to have children.
There was a chap on Tinder. They now give you reporting. So how many swipes you've had. Actually, they do it like a sales funnel. So if I was trying to help someone marketing, I'd say, hey, talk to 10 women. You might get 3 numbers. You arrange 2 dates. And one of them, they're giving you that funnel now on Tinder. And there was one guy who swiped over 1 million times. And I think he never got a match. And they looked at his profile picture and it's him holding a fish. And the internet went crazy and we're like, hey, bro, women are not interested in how big that carp was. So maybe pick a different picture. But the sad reality is that's 1 million attempts with 0 outcomes. If you'd put that attempt into a different place, like politely complimenting a stranger, it would have been nowhere near 1 million before he had a successful outcome. The problem is that people, at 900,000 swipes, he still hadn't considered that this was maybe not the place that he should be trying to find love. And that's what really breaks me. And like I say, so many people out there charismatic that might just not fit that quota. Because ultimately, I think that the top 10 or 20% of men are getting the majority of women. And I think expectations have been massively warped by social media. And if it was up to me, I would create dating environments, date nights, single nights. We used to have I went to a traffic light party once. Have you heard of that?
No.
So you go dressed in the color of your availability. So green is your single, red is your taken, and yellow is your unsure. So then you're in this whole debate whether or not, oh, if I go green, I could look a bit keen. If I go red, there could be someone sick and twisted that wants to try and sleep with me. But if I go orange, maybe it's fair game. These were all fun things that you do at universities and going out. But some of the biggest issues as well that I find, and it's crazy because I think alcohol is bad for you. I think it makes you do bad decisions. I think out of all the drugs you could take recreationally, it's one of the worst. But I kind of feel like it's missing in younger generations where, people can, reduce their inhibitions, have the bravery to talk to a stranger. I almost feel like that's missing, but that could definitely be what a 36-year-old says. Oh, they're not drinking enough pints. That's what.
Well, someone else put this to me. They're not drinking enough, and my answer was that in strict Muslim countries, traditionally the fertility rate's been quite healthy. I mean, it's not that healthy anymore in countries like Iran, but in places where alcohol was strictly forbidden. So I think that's a peculiar Anglo-Saxon thing that I've never really been into. The idea that you have to get totally sloshed before you can talk to someone. People who are happy to go on podcasts are probably the people when they were younger who were quite happy to talk to women and didn't really care. But I think we've got to get over our inhibitions. And it's a shame if you need to have alcohol to do that. Now, the sorts of things you're talking to me about now are going to be really important to many of your listeners. They're going to be young people who are thinking about, how do I date? How do I find someone? And, again, I just don't think I've got any particular insight. I think it's got to be sorted. It can be sorted out. It's not beyond human capacity to do so. But it's not for me to say, I've never been on a dating app and I haven't been on a date since I got married in 92. So it is a real issue. It is a real problem among all the others we've got, among housing and childcare. It seems that we've got to a very un-child-friendly place and people aren't having kids. And then we're looking at every aspect of society and we're pointing the finger and we're saying, that's the problem, that's the problem. That gets back to what I said to you earlier. It's not one thing. But if we actually change the culture somehow so that having kids young, reasonably young, was cool and exciting and people actually understood how wonderful it was, then all of these things would find a way to be resolved.
If you could put one thing into action today, say, unfortunately, let's say your phone rings and it's Keir Starmer.
Yeah.
No one wants to take that phone call.
No,
he comes along and he says,
not.
right, starting tomorrow, you unlimited resources of money that we don't have. What would be the first lowest hanging fruit that you'd want to implement?
I think something that's really easy to do would be to change the education in schools. Look at the sex education that kids get. Do they understand how quickly their fertility falls off in their 30s? Do men understand how unlikely it is in their 40s and 50s? So it's not just a women issue. And are we focusing entirely on avoiding pregnancy and STDs? Or are we focusing on how do you think about your life? How do you model your life in your teens? So that it's not like brainwashing people. It's just like thinking, when I think about it's very difficult. Like if you're 15, 5 years is an eternity. Whereas when you're 60, 5 years goes in a flash. But people would start thinking about, okay, I want to go to university, or maybe I don't want to get a job, save up. What point do I start thinking about if you want children? Most people still do want children. At the moment, I think that's not in the education curriculum. And therefore, people kind of wander into their 30s and somehow at the back of their mind think it will all be sorted out. So that's a low-cost way. Reorient the personal, whatever it's called, sexual. I mean, my kids had it at school. I had it in some format. It's always changing its name. Reformat the education in the school. It won't cost any more to focus people on the really important issue of having kids rather than the other issues which you could educate them on, but I think are putting them off having sex and having children.
Yeah, trying to say to them, hey kids, there's a wonderful thing in your life. It'll be the best thing that ever happens to you. Hopefully you don't go through this whilst you're still at secondary school, but having a child is the best thing ever, rather than putting a condom on a banana and saying, if you don't do this, you're going to get AIDS.
Yeah, you're going to die.
And you're going to ruin your life.
And giving people some idea of the time horizons, some realistic sense of the time horizons.
And even as well, for myself included, I think that being a productivity fiend, I got to 32, then 33, and I was like, oh, maybe next year. I've got a podcast to do this year. And now it's only through having my first child, which was an accident, that I realized, oh, none of this is anywhere near as important as my child. And it was only when you first have a child that you go, wow, this is more important than anything. And I don't think anyone would ever say a year into having a child, oh, I wish I pushed this back a couple of years. No one. Even
And we've got to communicate that passion that you're talking about, which is what I felt when I had children, and I felt again when I had grandchildren. That's what people don't talk about enough. That discussion, that passion, that prioritization has got to get into the conversation so that the culture changes and that people change what they actually do, change their behavior. But I think that people are almost embarrassed to talk about that.
yeah, I think there's some virtue in it as well. And I think if someone was to have the implication of having a child 2 or 3 years too early, sure, you might have less trips to Ibiza, you might see less of the world, which you could always do in later life. But the implications of having it late, actually, one of my favorite comedians, Andrew Schultz, made a stand-up special about going through IVF and the struggle it was to conceive, to have a child. And it was a very emotionally gripping, sad story with a lot of jokes, because he made a lot of jokes about the IVF process. But it was so great for him to talk about things, and even to mention that finasteride, the pills that he takes to help his hair stay thick, impacted his fertility. There are so many of these things that people just don't talk about. And I see a lot of successful people. I work with a lot of successful people. And it gets to a point that no matter, and again, this is me projecting my values on someone else, but it gets to a point where you can have all the money in the world, be as successful as possible, but then, being a multimillionaire in your late 30s and being childless can make a family man now feel like there's something missing, feel like there's something a bit sad. But then that is me imposing what I believe is good in life onto someone else.
But I think it sort of gets back to where we started, which is you said, what's the problem of not having enough children? And I said, there's a personal thing and then there's an economic thing. And I can talk about the economics, about the upside down population pyramid, about the problems in Korea, about government finances. None of that's actually going to persuade it. It might persuade policymakers to do something to skew the pitch in favor of having children. But none of that is going to persuade people. What's really going to persuade people is the other side, which is, this is the most wonderful thing I've ever done. This beats everything else. This gives the purpose and the meaning to my life. And it's certainly what I feel. It's clearly what you feel. And we just got to find a way of communicating it that is going to resonate with young people, rather than, oh, he's telling me I'm being selfish and I shouldn't go on holidays and I really want to go off to the Caribbean or Ibiza or wherever. And I don't want to be preachy about it, but we've somehow got to get that message over, that it is the most amazing and wonderful thing, because you create a new person, or 2 new people, or heaven forbid 3 new people, and each of them is different, and each of them's funny in their own way, and each makes their own demands, and each of them challenges you in different ways, and each of them makes you more of a person, actually brings out the fullness of your humanity.
What is it that's causing Korea to have such poor fertility rates?
If you look at why, so I said to you earlier, when people say, oh, the answer is ... I do a lot of podcasts. So I sometimes look at the comments. Sometimes there are thousands of comments, so I don't look at them all. But there are lots and lots of comments. And often people will say, oh, the one thing is, he doesn't realize it's just about. And then they'll give a perfectly good reason, but it's only one of the many multi-causal things. I think the trouble in Korea is, and first of all, it's a general East Asian thing. So any prosperous society or semi-prosperous society in East Asia seems to have this problem. And it seems to be a combination of a bunch of things that all work towards low fertility rates. So first of all, there's no real Abrahamic tradition. There's no Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. Now, it's true, Christianity did come late to Korea, and there are quite a lot of Christians, but there's no real Christian tradition. Where you have a Christian, Islamic, or Jewish tradition, you do find higher fertility. So, for example, look at Thailand, Buddhist, compared to the Philippines, which is Christian, predominantly Christian, and Indonesia, predominantly Muslim. There is definitely, it's not that you don't have very low fertility in Christian, Muslim, and Islamic countries, but it seems to slow the thing down. So there's just not that tradition, that traditional culture of an Abrahamic religion. The second thing is you've had very, very rapid economic development. And where that hits really, really quickly, very successful as an economy, you do find very often people's fertility falls very, very rapidly as well. Thirdly, you've got an extreme compression of people into very small spaces. Why they all want to go to Seoul. I mean, I went to South Korea and people said to me, well, I can't afford to have children. I'm living in Seoul. And I said, well, could you think about a career outside Seoul? Could you think about moving to a provincial city where the accommodation is more affordable? There's this very strong tendency in Korea for people to concentrate in Seoul. And then the last thing is a very, very competitive society. And everybody wants their child to be brilliant and succeed. And therefore you have one child. If you have one child, and you put all the resources into that child, all the pressure, all the education and the tutoring and so on to get that one child into the best university. And it ends up being a not very happy society, as well as a society without many children.
I think status for so many people now is a currency that's been more important now than ever before. Again, with social media, maybe even dating apps, wanting to have a Rolex on or whatever it is. So a lot of young people now, I think that in their bid to grow their status financially with achievements in their professional life, those things almost, I think, can be more important to those people now. They think, oh, I really want a fast car. So,
and again, it's a cultural thing. How do we change it? That the status is he's 25 and he's got 2 kids and the third is on the way. How would that be the status?
And that would be fantastic.
And they're gorgeous kids. And they, yes, he's tired he comes in the office tired on a Monday morning, but he's got meaning in his life. He's got joy. I don't want to sound too evangelical. And I don't think it can only be a religious thing. We're not suddenly going to become a super religious society, although religious people do have more children. But how do we change status so that personally, I never notice the watch someone has. I'm completely uninterested in it. Not because I'm a worthy person. It just doesn't interest me. I've got no interest in cars. I'm much more interested in people. How do we change it into a world? I don't want everyone to be like me. God forbid that'd be a terrible world. But where people have those values that say, oh, I'm much more interested in when you're having another child, and I don't think people should put undue pressure, but you're having another child, how wonderful, and you celebrate that, and when the child comes into the world, it's a wonderful thing, and how's he developing, and has he been potty trained, or she been potty trained, and what words are they speaking, that's incredibly, objectively, that is so much more exciting and wonderful than a Rolex or a motor car, and I think we just got to change our priorities. Again, I haven't got a single message as to how we can do that, but people like you, of your generation and with your sort of cultural pull, are going to be much more effective at doing it.
Some of my biggest motivators in life have been about impressing my parents. I love my childhood, love being brought up, do everything to try and, make them proud, etc. And this was actually in a psychedelic experience about 3 years ago that over a couple of magic mushrooms sat by the beach, I was thinking about, I was actually quite undecided about whether or not I wanted to have kids. And the first thing that I pondered about was seeing life as like a flame that you keep going. And I thought hundreds of thousands of years, like you say, Edwardian times, Victorian times, prehistoric times, all the way back to however far it goes, all of these people fighting through every kind of conditions possible to keep the lineage alive. And it gets to me in 2021 going, nah, rather play Call of Duty. To me, that felt quite sad. And that's not me saying to other people what they should do. But the second thing was, I've come home with a gold Rolex. My dad's like, oh, that's nice. Come home with a car, that's nice. I bought my dad a car. He's like, oh, that's nice. When I told him I was having a child, he cried. Like, he never cried over the gold Rolex. He never went, oh my God, son, that's beautiful. Is this a GMT? Never cared. It was a cool accomplishment. Like, oh, cool, my son's got a Rolex. But the fact that he broke into tears when I told him over dinner, that was special. And again, I've thought about all the things that I could come home with. And if I was to say to mom and dad, hey, I paid off your mortgage, they were like, thanks, son. If I go, I'm having another child, they break down to tears again. And it was only me experiencing that firsthand that I realized my values were kind of sick and twisted. That's the point. If I snap out, if I look back now, I go, what were you thinking, mate? Like, no one really cares. It's just...
So I do think grandparents have got a role to play. And, as I said, I'm a grandparent. I've got 4, and I hope I have quite a lot more. I may have several more. And I think grandparents have got a role to play in 2 ways. First of all, a role to play in putting the pressure on. Okay, I wouldn't... cavil with that. Each child is different, each parent-child relationship is different, but I think some sense of that's what you expect. And I remember actually when I was married, just got married, and we went to see some people who very young got married and had kids, and we were in awe of them, how much they were doing. They were nappy changing, and this one needed to be taken here and that one there, and the dad said, someone did it for you. And when we had our kids, we often said someone did it for you. So that pressure, a little bit of pressure from the grandparents' generation, I think helps. That's what we'd expect. That's what we'd love you to have. And then once they have children, to provide the support they can. And I do read about these boomer grandparents who are saying, we're not going to do anything. You're on your own. I think it's important that people who are retired do enjoy their lives, but there should be space to give some support for the next generation. And it's a huge win-win-win, because for grandparents, it's an enormous joy. For the parents, it's enormous relief. And for the kids, it's another set of very close and important relationships, which then links them, as I was saying, my own grandparents were all born before the First World War, and they had amazing stories to tell about their upbringing, their childhood. It does link you in with history. And when we had our first grandchild, which is just over 2 years, but 2.5 years ago, our friends were starting to have grandchildren, and I was feeling a little bit left out. And now we've got other friends who've been feeling a bit left out, but now their kids are having children. So I think the grandparents' generation have a really important role to play in influencing the culture in their own family, and also helping pick up the responsibilities, because it is jolly hard now with both parents at work. All the if you can help financially, if you can help with time, however you can help, not enslaving yourself to your kids and not making it the only priority in your life. But there's a lot, for those who are retired, those who are lucky enough to be retired, there's a lot of time to give. And every hour, 2 hours, weekend away can make a huge difference. So I think everybody benefits from it. And I think there's an important role for grandparents to play.
One unexpected consequence of having children as well was the relationship it built with my parents even further. Because there's those times you get up at 2 a.m, you're going downstairs, you're feeding my son. I'm thinking, do my parents do this? And one thing that I've actually said to friends is, fuck, I complain a lot. I never heard my parents complain once. I was a shit growing up. But they never went, oh, fucking hell, change your nap. They never moaned. It was just part of it. And I think that I probably need to communicate more, to just be grateful to my parents and be like, look, I'm going through this now. I've only been in the trenches a year and a half, but they did that for 18, 20 years odd until I went. And what you say there about grandparents kind of giving the nudge a little bit, I actually think this is a really healthy discussion, because your grandparents saying to you like, oi, feel free to have kids. When you do, we're here. If you want to keep working, we'll come round. If you need support, we'll be there. If you want to stay in bed tomorrow and have a lay-in, we'll do the morning feed. And that kind of pressure off the shoulders to know that your parents are there to have your back, I think is amazing. Unfortunately for myself, I've moved to Australia, so we get one set of grandparents, and I feel guilt for that as well. Not that my parents don't see enough of my son, but on the flip side, that we have moved, or I've moved far away, that we don't have that generational support pattern that really I'm starting to feel a little bit now, where if we were probably 100, 200 years ago, you probably live on the same street or in the same area, and then you've got aunties, uncles, 2 immediate families coming together to bring up a child. So the fact that I have a closer relationship with my parents since having children, I think is another thing that people don't talk about enough.
I think there's another point, and you kind of hinted at it, and I think we have to be very careful about what we say, but we are, each of us, part of a nation and part of a tradition that goes back hundreds of years. And we all relate to that in a different way. But if you want your group, some people are self-hating. Some people don't care whether their group goes on, just as they don't care whether humanity goes on. But we are human beings, but we're also divided into nations and ethnicities. And if you have any sense of the history of your group, you should have a sense of wanting that group to continue. To me, that's very normal and natural. I think 100 years ago, that would have been normal and natural anywhere. I think if you go to a country like Japan, where people don't have enough children, but they do want the Japanese tradition to continue, or indeed Korea, there are countries where they have that sense of wanting the group to go on, but they're not having enough children. But I think that's also an important part of it, that you want your country to be strong, you want your people to go on. And I think that's a global phenomenon. I don't think we should be embarrassed about that either. If people don't feel it, fine. But I think a lot of people do feel it. And I think people are almost shy of talking about it.
Yeah, there's been a lot of a movement recently, especially for Western countries to not be proud of their lineage, but to be proud of their race and where they fit in a multicultural society. There was Konstantin Kissin in a live debate trying to explain how it was the British that ended slavery, and he's getting booed and cooed and people are trying to silence him. And he was saying, this is the problem, guys. You should be proud of who you are. You should want, like you say, your group to thrive and to coexist and to grow. But for some reason, I think in some different cultures, they're almost ashamed, especially the younger generations. They don't want to join the army. They don't want to be patriotic. They don't want to, improve or increase the bloodline or multiply, because they've been kind of brought up in an echo chamber that you should be ashamed of who you are, where you've come from. And surely over time, if birth rates and fertility rates are different between cultures, it's only going to be a matter of time before one culture is more dominant than others, and people having less kids, while some people having more kids and more kids. Demographics and cultures and ethnicities are going to change across countries.
Well, that comes back to my first book, which is actually my PhD thesis, was about demographic conflict. So ethnicities in conflict and how they use demographic strategies. So I don't want this to sound conflictual, but you're absolutely right. If one group is pronatal, is family oriented, wants to expand, and another group is keen to beat itself up and wants to see itself disappear and has no sense of continuity or worth, then the first group will grow and expand and the second group won't. And every individual who makes a decision about whether to have children is not going to have top of mind the continuity of my people. But that should be in there somewhere. And once a people ceases to want to continue to exist, it will cease to exist.
I think I saw a statistic. I could be wrong, but we're very much kind of kept in this discussion that we have minorities and other cultures that we need to accommodate for. But am I right in thinking that you could say white Caucasian across the planet, maybe 10, 11% of the population?
I think it's less than that now, and certainly reducing.
So when we see, discussions online about different cultures and everything like that, we sometimes just look at the United Kingdom, or we might look at America, and we might look at being like this mass part of the population. But as the world as a whole, we are technically a minority of a culture, but we never see it like that. So I think that sometimes in those kind of predominantly white Caucasian cultures, they might see that as a reason to not reproduce. There's white people everywhere, there's loads of us, there's too many of us, and that could hinder the growth. What percentage do we think it's potentially at?
Well, I've seen suggestions that it will go down to sort of 6-7%. I mean, I don't spend my time worrying about the white race. It's not a sort of term that I talk about or think about, but I do think about the future of the people of Britain. I mean, I'm the son of immigrants. I'm not ethnically British or English, but this is the country I've been born into, grown up in. I'm extremely appreciative of everything that Britain has been and has been for my family who came as immigrants, and the kind of incredibly civilized, decent place it is. And to be honest, I find it very distressing that people are ashamed of their nationality, their background, and have no sense of wanting to keep that going. And it's the same thing in every country, in every nation, in every ethnicity. Some sense of wanting to continue it is perfectly normal and natural. And it's only in certain societies and cultures and nations and races that is an unsayable thing. In others, like Japan, for example, it's so obvious, people wouldn't even discuss it.
How can we instill a sense of pride into people's nations? And do you think that would have a beneficial effect to fertility?
Well, I said Japan is a kind of counterexample, so is Korea. So again, it's not sufficient. It won't do it by itself. If that's all you've got, but you're still very urban, very concentrated, very competitive, you don't have a Judeo-Christian tradition, you have a small family in order massively to invest in one child, that's not going to do it. But it should be part of the mix. And of course, the answer to that is the media, the education system. An awful lot could be reoriented to celebrating what we've achieved and not denigrating it.
If we don't fix all of the things we mentioned, it's been so fantastic over the last hour or just over to talk about all these things. If we don't fix all of these different components, how fast could we anticipate? And the word collapse is thrown around. I'll say it now. How far would we be from a population collapse?
Well, I don't think we'll have a population collapse in Britain, because we continue to be a massively attractive place for people to immigrate to. And I did some work on what I call the demographic trilemma, which is that there are three things you can have. You can have a low fertility rate, what I call the E of egotism. It's the Rolex rather than the nappies. The egotism of the small family. You can have the E of economic buoyancy, and you can have the E of ethnic continuity. You can have two, but not all three. So if you want the ethnic continuity and the economic dynamism, you've got to give up the egoism and have children. And that's kind of, Israel's the only example in the developed world where people are doing that. But if you want the E of economic growth and you want to hold on to the E of egotism and not have big families, then you've got to have mass immigration. And that's what's happening in Britain. Now, some people celebrate the rapid ethnic change in this country, and some people don't celebrate it. Most people, I think, believe that immigration has been too fast, too hectic a pace. And of course, a lot of the immigration is not related to the needs of the economy. But nevertheless, ultimately, the choice is if you as a people and a country are not going to reproduce yourselves, then you will either go the Japanese route of slowly disappearing or villages declining, everyone concentrating in the big towns and those getting very old, or you'll go the British route of saying, well, we'll just fill our boots with immigrants. We don't mind where they come from, we'll just fill them. So I don't think Britain's economy is going to collapse, but I think that creates all sorts of other tensions and pressures on how you keep a cohesive society going. Globally, my concern is that more and more countries, if we just get out of the sort of British Isles or the UK perspective for a moment, more and more countries are moving very rapidly to low fertility rates. And if we all get to the Korean level, then as I've said, it's only a slight exaggeration to say that each cohort will be 1/3 of the size of the last. Now, how is that disaster going to strike? I think we can already see it in sluggish economic growth, government debt, all this money that needs to be spent on the elderly, on their healthcare, on their social care, not enough taxpayers, more and more burden on those young taxpayers who in turn can't start families or leave the country. So I think we'll have it'll express itself probably in a labor force and a financial crisis. And the last time we had the IMF come in to save us in Britain was back in the 1970s. I'm not sure if they'll ride to the rescue. So we can see the debt burden growing. And I don't think Rachel Reeves understands that wouldn't be the case if people in the 70s, 80s and 90s had 3 kids each and our whole society were different. So I think the collapse will express itself in terms of the collapse of the welfare state and how people react politically when the government simply doesn't have the money to pay for their healthcare and to pay for their pensions. It's impossible to say, but I don't think it's going to be a Tea Party.
And then I suppose the final part to that would be if you were to increase fertility rates to, let's say, 2.1 and above, you then have a bit of a growing pain for,
exactly.
let's say, 16 to 18 years.
Yeah, up to 20 years, yes. So you've got to understand that there is a period when not only have you got all that burden of the older generation, but you now have to put a lot more into education. And that's why we have to, if we're going to do this, we've got to reorientate the whole welfare state towards encouraging and supporting young people. And there will be losers in that game. But if we don't do it, we'll all be losers.
Left me thinking we might have to put something in the tap water, get people a little bit more keen to have children.
Maybe a chemical solution.
That's been such an insightful conversation. I've learned so much. And hopefully to the people listening, their perceptions around family life, having children, fertility, everything, I think they're going to have a lot to think about. And hopefully we can start to see a bit of an increase in people deciding to do that wonderful thing, which is having kids. So thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks for having me.